In this video, I want to talk about beginning sewing your hand wovens. Now this is just a test piece. It's a woven band. It looks like I did this on an ankle loom. Now what I've done, and you might want to do some practice of this, just to get the hang of how you have to, well, in an ankle band it's a warp-faced weaving, and you have to make sure you catch all the threads or else your edge is going to fray. A good practice to start with is to making your own bias tape or buying like quilt binding, and I've got that folded over, and then I think you can see here I have folded it in half. On this particular piece I decided to also stay stitch the edge in place. And I'm watching the dog as I'm doing this, making sure he's not ripping something. And that's part of why I'm doing this. So I have stay stitched that because I don't want that raw edge to move at all while I'm stitching. So a simple ankle band, and normally with ankle bands I sew right through the band. But this is a way to start thinking about finishing seams and more or less sewing with hand spun as you make bigger garments. And that would be leading up to my rosewood fabric being like a sweater. So this is the Singer 237. And I've done this with green thread, so that you can see, here's the stay stitching, and there's the actual sewing through the band. And what you want to then do is try to pull it apart. So you want to make a couple of these test things with different stitch lengths on your machine with a piece of the fabric you're going to be sewing. Now I have the 237 set at 6 stitches per inch right there, and I went over it twice, and that's not going to come apart. And you could see the other day I did the same stitching right across the band. So this is the way to start fiddling around with your weaving. Now this is partly why I want you to start doing test edgings or endings or finishings of your weaving. These I like to make narrow strip rugs. At least I did before I got the new dog. My wheelchair and my walker go right around them, and yet they give me something on the floor. But you can see this was woven just on, I used cotton string and thick, bulky worsted weight, well, bulky worsted weight 2-strand made it bulky. I can't really leave this out as a rug because the dog will be chewing all of this. So what I'm going to be doing to finish this is actually using tarp fabric. I'm going to do the same thing, make a piece of folded bias to go on the end. And the reason I want to do this, one, I get to use the rug again. I had tied them in knots for him to play with, but he was just chewing on that, and I don't want him doing that. So one, I'll get to use the rug again, and two, it gives me practice. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 16 warps in this. And I have to be able to catch all 16 warps. So it'll give me practice in order to use, have, you know, these different gauges of weaving give you an idea of the best way to end a fabric strip like this or sew something together, starting to learn a pattern of the gauges of weaving and the type of fabric or stitching that you might need at the end or on a seam. After you've done some test edging or finishing on the edges of small weaving pieces, and you get to the point where you're weaving your own fabrics, what you have to adapt to with each garment or project is the weight and gauge of the weaving. So one example was an ankle loom band, and one example was a very bulky band. This is kind of in the middle, which is worsted weight, plain weave, on a Harrisville Designs rigid heddle, about 7 inches wide. Now, I have woven 30 feet of this in case I wanted to make a jacket. I think I had finished a bulky sweater, and I think that I would rather have a vest, because even at this weight, I could wear a vest under the bulky sweater, whereas I wouldn't wear 2 sweaters, probably. So what I need to do is I need about a 24-inch width, which would be 3 strips with a little extra, and I need about a 20-inch length. So this, and I had already made a separate narrow band that is going to be the straps. But you can see how I was just using up the yarn that I had and made as much fabric as I thought I was going to need. Now this should be fairly easy to stay stitch across the bottom. And all I have to do is use probably this as a test piece and do some stitching on this to see what comes out best. So when you do weave a big project, you should always make yourself a swatch to test the stitching out on. So when you're putting together a garment, this is how I'm going to make a vest. I need 3 pieces for the front and 3 for the back. And then I'm going to have a simple narrow band, 1 on each side for straps. There are a couple of ways to stitch the seams together. Here's one. Now, lining up the 2 edges and hand stitching with either the brown or the pink yarn, and go right up and put together a nice flat seam. When you're done, you will have brown stitching showing. That will show. The second way is to do the same thing and use a zigzag machine and zigzag it together. So the first step is, for me, I'm going to cut 3 strips for each, the front and the back, a total of 6 strips that are the exact length I need for the length of the vest. I am then going to stay stitch across the 2 ends of each piece. So I'll have 3 workable pieces of fabric for each the front and the back. Now the third method of sewing things together is to treat it just like any other fabric. Line up the 2 technically raw edges right sides together and stitch right down here. Now because these are 7 inches wide, more than 6, I can do a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and what that's going to do is give me a seam that looks like that when you open it up. And I think what I'm going to do for finishing, instead of using a seam tape, I am going to then, so let's pretend this is sewn together like that, and I've got these 2 pieces that are the seam allowance. I'm going to fold those open like that, and then stitch each one down like that. So when you look at the outside of the garment, you won't see the middle seam, but you'll see 2 lines going down next to the seam that hold this fabric in place. And so that's 3 different ways that you have to sew your fabric together. And really the rule of thumb is whatever is easiest that looks the way you want it to look at the end. So what I'm going to do next is cut 6 strips of fabric and then stay stitch across the edges after I work out on here how what the machine should be set at. Now if you're going to hand stitch everything, you could do all the same things, but when you're finishing the edge, I would then hand sew seam tape or bias tape or something, even spare fabric, and then turn the edge up. So cut off the fringe, hand stitch a piece of fabric there or a bias tape, fold that all up to the length that you need, and sew the other edge of the bias tape in place, more or less hemming the item first. But if you do it by hand, you have to make sure you catch all the threads going across. So it would have to be a very close hand stitching to grab everything together, and then with a seam tape, even if you only turn it up a ½ inch. But that would be finishing your edges before you had to. And then you'd have to make a couple of adjustments when you go to hand stitch the pieces together, because you'd have these edges folded up. But you can do all of that easily with hand stitching. This I'm going to do by machine. So I'm going to cut the pieces, stay stitch the edges, and then start stitching the pieces together lengthwise. So here are my 6 pieces, and I haven't stay stitched them yet, I've just cut them. I also ended up with scraps that I can use as smaller test pieces. But I wanted to point out to you that you can also use this method to make a rug, which is why the dog's barking. He thinks this is his new rug. You can now stitch the strips together and then go around the whole thing, all 4 sides of the rectangle, and you have a throw rug. But I'm going to make this into a vest. Okay, so this is the Singer Model 237. This is a swatch of the fabric. I have not even picked up the thread yet because I just put in brown thread. I'm using a purple thread bobbin thread. I have the machine set at 8 stitches per inch. And you can see that because of the raw edges, I have to come fairly far in, about a ½ inch, in order to just stitch this. And when you run into that where it grabs a little bit, you have to find out why and if it's going to stick. But right off the bat, I can tell that's catching everything. That's not going to come undone. So now I can go ahead and stay stitch the edges of the fabric at 8 stitches per inch. What I'm going to do here, and a lot of modern machines don't have it, I'm going to increase the pressure just a bit on the presser foot, because this is a puffy fabric because of the weaving. And you'll see it moves along just a little bit better with a slightly increased pressure on the presser foot. Now if I decide I want fringe on the bottom of the vest, then all I will be doing at the bottom of the vest is first making sure that I have the fabric even at the bottom, and then stay stitching, say 2 inches above the bottom, and working out the edges to be fringe on the bottom. That would make it kind of a 70s look, and I'm not sure how I want to do it yet. So you can see why you have to go in about 1/2 inch. And this is just the stay stitching, but that would be enough to hold the garment together. That's really what you want to make sure it's going to hold the garment together. And you'll have, so the stitching is not exactly even to the weaving, and this is where you'd be trimming this off anyway. So on this gauge weaving, 8 stitches per inch is fine. Now I've gone around this piece in a rectangle. Just trim that off. And I want to mention a couple of things. When I said that you could zigzag flat seam together 2 pieces, you can, but with zigzag you're going to have a finished edge to do that with. Otherwise you'd only be picking up every other thread or so as you zigzag it. So you can't do that on a raw edge and pick up everything. But this is now just like commercial fabric. This is a little piece of fabric. Now, the other thing to consider is if you're using a commercial pattern and you want to weave your own fabric, and you either weave it the width that the pattern calls for, like a 36-inch wide fabric seamed once, or if you have your width of the fabric, now it's going right out of my head. When you cut it to a commercial fabric, when they give you the seam allowance on the pattern, the most I've seen is like a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you may need to consider that you're going to need at least a 1/2 inch because of the fraying tendency of a hand-woven fabric. But this is like a little hanky now that I can do anything with, because all of the weft and the weave are gathered. So let's just do a zigzag stitch, just so you can see that it's not going to catch everything. But essentially this fabric is just like any other fabric once the edges are stay stitched like that. So by having a finished edge on my strips, I can do a zigzag back and forth to hold the strips together, but it would be better to do probably a straight seam. And again, it depends on the gauge. If I were doing a very tightly woven fabric, zigzag might work better, but I think if I were doing, that's the widest zigzag, if you can see it. Here's a point to it, and there's another point to it. So it's not really wide enough on this machine. It will catch the edges and hold flat finished edge fabric together. Here's maybe a better example showing up on the pink. But it's not going to make an extremely strong seam. It's almost like basting. So I think in my case I would either hand stitch that together, or do the other method that I said, where I'm going to stitch it just like it's regular fabric and then open up the seam allowances and stitch them down. Now, as an added step, just to make sure this is as usable as it seems, without any shifting or anything, I'm going to hand wash this and hand dry it and work it around in a tub and use it. In the meantime, I can stay stitch the edges of the fabric I cut, but before I finally decide on the best way to use this, I'm going to actually use it. Now this is just another scrap piece that I'm stay stitching the raw edges, and I want to point something out. I'm going to leave the finished selvages that are already contained. I'm going to leave those, and I'm just stay stitching the two edges, and you need to make sure you go back off the fabric. So I started here, then I did some back stitching to secure it, and I went off the fabric, and now I'm starting forward again, and I'll do the same at the other end. I'll go off the fabric and then back onto it again. You don't want to leave, when you're sewing commercial woven fabrics, the weaving is usually so tight that you don't have to catch that final thread. You don't always have to back up off the fabric because the seam will hold and maybe you just have a little flap of fabric. But with hand woven, especially at a gauge of worsted weight yarn, you've got a bigger warp and a bigger weft, and you just don't want any loose threads that might lead to the whole fabric coming apart later on. So you can see I've gone off the fabric, and now I'll back up and secure it. So that is how I'm going to be stay stitching all the edges. And then a couple of the weft threads are coming out already, the brown. I had used pink warp with a brown weft. And yet these are the finished edges of the selvages. So now this is, again, this becomes a scrap piece of fabric that you can use as any other scrap piece of fabric you have. So I had woven 30 feet of fabric, which I'm not going to use all of that, and I now have scraps of these fabric. But just so you know, 30 feet, 7 inches wide on a Harrisville Designs 7-inch wide 8-dent heddle. I used 18 ounces of each color. So I bought 3 Red Heart Super Saver skeins, jumbo. 3 Red Heart Super Saver jumbo skeins of each color, perfect pink and coffee. And I ended up using 18 ounces of each color to get 30 feet of weaving. Okay, it helps if you have a mannequin. This is a mannequin. If you don't, you can just do this on the floor. Now, I've got 3 front pieces stay stitched at each end. But what I want to show you is they're long and they're not perfectly even at the edges because of the way the fabric frays. And here's the shoulder. I have a bag over my mannequin. Here's the shoulder. Here is about the armpit. And if this is a vest, these pieces really need to be down around here. But I cut these pieces long, especially for this first one, because what I'm going to be doing one way or another is folding this over. And knowing I need at least a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I left plenty of fabric for both the top and the bottom, so that the next step is to stitch these 3 pieces together, then make a similar piece for the back, probably sew the whole thing in a ring, and then fit it to the mannequin. And I'll be doing some side-to-side fitting when I sew the front to the back. So make my 2 pieces, adjust on both sides to fit the width I need, and then I'll finish the top and the bottom edges evenly, and then add the straps after that. So if you're doing a first project and not sure of an actual finished seam allowance or an actual length, if I want to make this a long vest, where the fabric is now would go to about my upper thigh. I can make it a long pullover vest. It would be warm. It would be like a dress. I could make a dress. You see how when you start creating with your own fabric, your thought process becomes, wow, how will this look the best? Do I want this? Do I want that? Do I want to embellish it? Already, because I'm looking at this fabric, I'm thinking, do I want plain patch pockets to kind of be a counterpoint to the woven? It's a wonderful way to create and design your own clothes, is by weaving simple strips. What if this vest is actually an apron, and you put a wide pocket across the front, then you've got a work apron or a garden apron. Simple structure. This could also have been a coat or a cardigan. If I decide, I still have enough fabric probably to make sleeves, but I am going to make a vest. You see how all of a sudden, when you're putting your strips of fabric together, you're thinking, okay, now I know how to make a coat, now I know how to make an apron, and it just continues. And it's a wonderful way to clothe yourself. And it's fun. Okay, I've started to stitch the pieces together, and if you have a marked needle plate, it always helps, and because you can keep your edge of the fabric right along one line. And I'm giving myself about a ½ an inch, and I am going to need to fold this over to about ¼ of an inch. So that's going to be a thick sew, and we'll see how that goes. I may change my mind after I get the initial seam done. Now, I actually, with a vest especially, I only need 18 inches across the front and 18 inches across the back. 3 strips of 7 inches is 21, and then I'm with a ½ inch seam allowance. You can see that you have to figure out what your finished width will be for each of the pieces that have 3 strips, one for the front and one for the back. I'm doing this all by hand crank. There's no motor on the machine. It's not taking me very long at all. The majority of the time was in weaving the fabric. So let's see how this is going to open up. Now, if you make a complicated plaid, which is the nightmare of a lot of people who sew, you would be lining up the plaid. So weaving leads to plaid. And so let's say you have a blue fabric with white weft every 5 inches. Then cutting your fabric, stay stitching it, everything would be slightly different because your priority is to line up the plaid. But with this being just a plain weave fabric, I'm not having to do that, and I can just go ahead and stitch the seams without worrying about that. So this is what we're talking about me doing afterward. after I stitch these, the seam, I then go down each side of the seam, and you'll end up seeing on this side 2 lines of stitching. You see, that's going to line up fine. I think you can see that. It's right here. That's not going to look like it's really seamed in 3 pieces. So I will stitch the pieces together and then go through, open up the whole piece, lay this flat and open like that, and go down either side of the seam. And then I will have a front and a back piece ready to sew together on one side. This is either the front or the back, one piece sewn together. Now you'll see I'm getting a little bit of curviness because of the weaving. My bottom edge is uneven, but that I don't care about because my top edge is more even, and I'm going to use that as the guide. Hem the top first and the bottom second, and that will be trimmed off. So why take this is just stitched like a regular seam. Why take the extra step and now stitch this down? It depends on your gauge. You don't have to do this. So this is the inside. If I don't take this step, and I guess you could put it to one side too, but an open seam will be strong. I'll actually have 3 lines of stitching, so the garment itself is not going to come apart, but it's really for the flatness of wearing it. And it's not going to take very long to do that, and that's a big difference between wearing it flat or wearing it with really what is a bulky edge. So what I'm going to do, because I'm getting a little bit of curve in the width, and where I am also with the width is I want to press this, and I'm going to use a pressing cloth with a medium iron because it's acrylic yarn. So I will finger flatten this open and then press it on this side with a pressing cloth, and then go back over it on the other side. But like I said, so now it's a little bit narrower than I thought it was going to be. It will fit. It will still fit. I could have made maybe a narrower seam allowance, but I don't think so. I mean, if it ends up being snug, I'm not going to be upset about it because that's kind of what I want. It's just that visually it's a little narrower than I expected. It'll widen out when I press it, and then I will go ahead and stitch those seams down. If you have a fine weight fabric, you may not need to do that step. Now keep in mind also, as you do this, I had woven quite a bit of extra fabric. I might even have enough to make 2 vests. Once I press this and then I stitch the seams down, if I find, it looks to me like it's going to fit like a shirt. If I decide I want it more loose than that, maybe to accommodate a turtleneck and long underwear or something, I can just add another panel to it. And then the strips would be off center, but you can just add more fabric. So it doesn't even come close to being a mistake. What it is fitting it to you. And because I'll have the front and the back that will fit like a shirt, if I decide I want it more loose, I just add another panel. I have my fabric strips sewn together, and pretty soon we're going to start finishing the top and then finishing the bottom, and it's easier to do it when you have your fabric laid out like this. But I'm also making a note here for other ways to make fabric. So this will be sewn in a circle with that being the top, that being the bottom, and vertical stripes that actually end up looking like a stitch pattern instead of a seam. But, so this one is going to be a vertical stripe, but I was just realizing when I was doing this that on the circular knitting looms, I have the boy round looms. With the long looms, once you know what the area around your waist needs to be, or around your body, then you buy the corresponding long loom. You can knit it, and you'd be working this way, and you'd be knitting the length you want. The other option is, when I did the length, this ended up uneven because I was just cutting it in a hurry. So on the left is the top, whoops, and on the right is the bottom, and the shortest one is about 23 inches long. So I have a 29-inch knitting board, and I could be, if you pretend the yardstick is the knitting board, knitting this way, and I need a total of 39 inches to make a comfortable vest. So these measurements, 39 inches that will go around the body, and I can use a 29-inch knitting board and make a long vest. So 3 different ways that you can make this, but this fabric was all done on a backstrap loom. So it came out 7 inches wide. As you can see, I put quite wide seam allowances on it, and then stitched down the seam allowances for better wearing when I put it together. This is the wrong side. But if you have a backstrap loom, and then of course the other way to do this is to do patchwork quilt fabric and keep your measurements. So 39 inches long, but I could go anywhere from 20 to 27 inches top to bottom. Once you have these basic measurements, you can then use all different types of fabric to make the same structured vest. In this case, it's a vest. If you wanted to make a sweater, you could use the, I forget what I called the video, but the knitted sweater panel pattern, where you just use either 4 or 5 panels and make a sweater. It's so easy to make your own clothes in different ways. So this is backstrap weaving, round loom knitting would be possible, and also knitting board knitting. And of course you could also do crochet granny squares and you know, regular either circular or straight needles and knit that way. But we're talking about either strips or rectangles, or in the case of round knitting, a tube that can make a simple vest. Now this is the next step, which is finishing the top edge. What I have done, you can use pre-bought quilt binding or bias binding. I like to have a nice wide binding to work with. So I made my own out of just some yellow gingham fabric, and I'm going to stitch it. This is the top edge, I'm going to pin it in place, and then I'm going to stitch the binding to the fabric. I'll do a little bit of trimming, like right here I'll trim that off, but I'm going to leave the stay stitching the way I had it. I just want to pin and make sure that the edge is caught on the other side and folded correctly. So like right there, you want to make sure that doesn't happen. So this will be stitched along like that. And then I'm going to turn the whole thing under evenly right to the edge and stitch it again here. So I'm actually using a binding to hem the raw edges. Very simple to do. I have pressed this first. Like I said, I'll pin it in place. I made extra because it tends to gather up a little bit as you stitch it. I'll make sure all these edges are covered the way I want them, and then like I said, after I get this edge stitched, so I'll be stitching along here, and if I pin it correctly I can probably just stitch it from the other side, but then when I fold it, I'll fold it like that. So there'll be a row of stitching there, and I'll leave about 1/4 of an inch when I turn it over. So none of the yellow is going to be visible on the outside of the garment. Then you trim the bottom edge to the length that you want, and you do the same thing. And you can see that I am stitching this from what is the right side of the fabric, taking the pins out as I go, as long as I'm sure that everything is stitched in place. And I'm using the left side of the presser foot as a guide, a seam guide. And I'm stitching very close to the edge, the left edge of the binding. And that's because I want to get that fold. When you make binding, you simply cut a wide strip and then press it so that each long edge folds in. And I want that folded edge to be caught completely when I'm stitching. It's very simple to do, and I'm actually doing this before I trim any extra yarn off of the other side, because some of that may include your stay stitching, and this then becomes stay stitching right across the top. And it makes it easier to trim if you have longer yarns on the other side. You can do it after you do this part of the sewing. It's getting a little hung up on the machine base here. And this is still the 237 set up as a hand crank. Very simple way to sew. And then just grab the pins out as you go. You can see I've trimmed this off even, more or less, and I've begun pinning it down. So I will pin it just like that all the way across, and then stitch it right here. And this is on the wrong side of the fabric. So before you pull it over to the wrong side of the fabric, it would look like that. And then you pull it over, make sure it's even all the way across with how much of a fabric edge you're going to leave there, and stitch it right there. And then at this point I have the upper edge finished, but not seamed for the final seam that closes it. I have it pinned to the mannequin with the basic way it's going to hang. And depending on your fabric, this is where you want to choose. If there are any flaws in the fabric, you might want to put them toward the back or the side. I was going to put the final seam under one arm. I decided to put it in the back, although I haven't stitched it yet. And now a mannequin helps because now it's easier to figure out how long I want this. I'm thinking it's going to go, this is not really a flaw, it's a double strand there. But I'm thinking about there. And then you have to figure I turned under about 2 inches on the top edge. So I would trim about at least 2 inches longer than I actually wanted. And make it somewhat of a long, this one, somewhat of a long vest. And I was saying in the other video, and the camera died, that you finish the top, the bottom half the same way, the bottom edge, the same way that you finish the top edge. My camera had stopped there for a minute. And this is in between finishing the bottom edge. And if you don't have a mannequin, you can measure from underneath your arm, just under your armpit, about an inch down from your armpit, to the length that you want. And then lay the fabric on the floor and trim it to that length plus the 2 inches or however much you're going to be turning it under. If you are weaving a lighter weight fabric, a beautiful addition at the top would be to use like a 500A sewing machine with all the pattern stitches and put embroidery at the top. I can't really do that with this thick fabric, but what I can do is do another line of stitching right there, which will give it kind of a banded look. I could even do it on the bottom when I get to that point. So I apologize for the battery dying on the other camera. And what I had been saying was you do the same to the bottom edge. And now we're showing you how to trim the bottom, making sure you add that length that you're going to be turning under. Cut that, I'm probably going to cut it straight across and handle the fabric very carefully while I pin that binding on the bottom, so that I don't end up with a lot of frays and do a new stay stitching when I put the binding on. When you have your fabric, top and bottom, finished off with the binding, it's time to just stitch the final seam. So, same seam allowance you've been using, double check your width, stitch it right down, and then to fold back the edges, you're going to have to make sure when you put it under the needle that you don't let the rest of the garment get in the way of the stitching. So you'll be pulling the rest of it, you know, so this will be under the needle, and all of this will be a circle around the needle, and you just have to avoid it when you stitch it. And then the last step is adding the straps. Now once you've tried it on, and remember this is, you can see how basic it is. It's a rectangle with 2 straps, really. You want to make sure that you left yourself enough room in the fit to pull it over your head and to get it on and off, because this is a pull-on vest. I had added an extra 7-inch panel, and if I hadn't have done that and it fit like a shirt, I would be I'd be at this stage, but then I'd be saying, you know what, it's just easier if I use a sweater method and now recut it down the front, make it a cardigan or a button-on vest. So I left myself instead enough room in the fit where I can just pull it over my head. It fits me. You want to make sure to lay it out like this after you try it on, and double check that you've got the straps in the right place where you want them. You stitch those and your vest is complete, and it's all hand woven.